She was just the instructor, the one who drew diagrams and explained theory while the real Marines did the shooting. No combat badges, no sniper patches, just mathematical formulas on a whiteboard. Until the day someone challenged her to prove she could actually do what she taught. One shot, 2.4 miles, perfect center mass. They never saw her as just the instructor again. Dot, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton's advanced marksmanship training facility as Staff Sergeant Maya Blackwood made her way to the outdoor classroom. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel path as she carried her worn leather briefcase containing training materials, diagrams, and ballistic charts that had served her well for 3 years of instruction. Unlike the Marines she taught, Maya wore no combat decorations, no sniper badges, nothing that would indicate her background beyond her instructor credentials. The open-air facility stretched across several acres of California desert with shooting positions arranged at various distances from 800 meters to over 4,000 meters. Steel targets dotted the landscape like metallic flowers, each one representing a different challenge in precision shooting. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of rifles from other training areas. Wind flags fluttered at measured intervals across the range, providing visual indicators of air current patterns that would prove crucial for long-range accuracy. Maya approached her usual spot beneath a canvas shelter that protected her whiteboard and teaching materials from the elements. She began setting up for the day's lesson on extreme long-range ballistics, a subject she had taught countless times to Marines who would later deploy to Afghanistan and Iraq. Her movements were methodical, practiced, each piece of equipment placed with the same precision she demanded from her students. The shelter itself was positioned to provide optimal viewing angles of the entire range, allowing students to observe practical demonstrations while maintaining safety protocols. At precisely 0800 hours, her class of 12 Marines arrived. They were an experienced group, most with at least one deployment behind them, all confident in their abilities with standard combat rifles. They arranged themselves on metal folding chairs in a semicircle facing Maya's teaching station, their attitudes ranging from respectful attention to barely concealed boredom. Several carried notebooks, though their body language suggested they viewed this as routine instruction rather than critical training. "Good morning, Marines," Maya began, her voice carrying clearly across the open space. "Today, we're covering ballistic calculations for targets beyond 2,000 meters. The mathematics become significantly more complex at these distances, and environmental factors that can be ignored at shorter ranges become critical variables." Private First Class Blake Hartwell, a young Marine with sharp features and an attitude to match, leaned back in his chair. He had qualified as an expert marksman and wasn't shy about letting others know it. His confidence bordered on arrogance, the kind that came from natural talent combined with limited real-world testing. Beside him sat Corporal Tyler Garrison, a veteran of 2 deployments who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had used these skills in combat. The contrast between the two was obvious to anyone with experience reading Marines. Maya turned to her whiteboard and began sketching trajectory curves, explaining how factors like air density, temperature, and humidity affected bullet flight at extreme distances. She drew careful diagrams showing how wind drift increased exponentially with range, how the Coriolis effect became significant beyond 1,500 meters. Her drawings were precise, technical, the work of someone who understood these concepts at a fundamental level. "The key to understanding extreme long-range shooting," Maya continued, "is recognizing that every environmental factor becomes amplified. A 1-degree temperature difference can mean a complete miss at 2,500 meters. Wind speed variations of just 2 miles per hour can push a bullet completely off target at maximum range." Blake shifted in his seat, exchanging glances with Tyler. He had been listening for 20 minutes to mathematical formulas and theoretical calculations, growing increasingly restless. The young Marine had come to this advanced course expecting hands-on shooting, not classroom instruction that seemed divorced from practical application. "Ma'am," Blake said, his tone respectful but skeptical, Have you actually taken shots at these distances? I mean, in the field, not just on a training range. Maya paused, her marker hovering above the whiteboard. Several Marines straightened in their chairs, sensing tension. She had fielded this question before, usually from Marines who assumed that instructors were just theoretical experts without practical experience. The question itself wasn't inappropriate, but the timing and tone suggested challenge rather than genuine curiosity. The calculations I'm teaching you have been proven effective in combat situations, Maya replied evenly, continuing her diagram. These formulas have saved lives and completed missions in theaters around the world. Now, as I was saying, wind speed calculations require multiple measurement points because air currents vary significantly over long distances. Blake's jaw tightened. He had asked a direct question and received what he perceived as evasion. His confidence, already inflated by his marksmanship scores, pushed him to press the issue. "That's not really an answer though, is it?" Blake interrupted, his voice gaining confidence. "I mean, anyone can read ballistic tables and teach theory, but shooting at 2,000 plus meters? That's different. That's like combat different. That's when all this math has to work under pressure." The other Marines watched the exchange with growing interest. Sergeant Lucas Brennan, the senior enlisted man in the group, shot Blake a warning look, recognizing that the young Marine was walking into dangerous territory. But Blake, focused on what he saw as intellectual dishonesty, didn't notice the sergeant's concern. Maya set down her marker and turned to face the class. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but those who knew how to read people might have noticed the slight change in her posture. She was no longer simply an instructor dealing with a question. She was evaluating a potential threat to unit cohesion and training effectiveness. "Is there something specific about the material you'd like clarified, Private First Class Hartwell?" Maya asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made several Marines shift uncomfortably. Blake, interpreting her restraint as weakness rather than control, pushed forward. "Just wondering if you've ever actually done what you're teaching us to do. I've taken confirmed shots at 1,200 meters downrange in Afghanistan. Tyler here dropped a target at 1,400 in Iraq. We're not questioning the math, ma'am, just, well, experience speaks louder than textbooks." Tyler looked distinctly uncomfortable with being dragged into the confrontation, but Blake pressed on, his voice gaining volume. "I mean, there's a difference between teaching theory and actually pulling the trigger when it counts. When there's incoming fire and your spotter is calling, wind changes every 30 seconds. Anyone can draw pretty pictures on a whiteboard when nobody's shooting back." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Maya looked at Blake for a long moment, then at the rest of the class. Several Marines shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Blake had crossed a line but uncertain how their instructor would respond. The morning breeze stirred the wind flags across the range, creating a soft rustling sound that seemed unusually loud in the quiet. Sergeant Brennan cleared his throat, preparing to intervene, but Maya raised a slight hand to stop him. Her eyes never left Blake's face as she considered her response. In her 3 years as an instructor, she had encountered this type of challenge before. Young Marines, talented but inexperienced, who mistook their limited combat exposure for comprehensive understanding. "I see," Maya said quietly. She walked over to where Blake sat and stopped directly in front of him. "So you're suggesting that my instruction lacks practical application?" Blake swallowed hard but held his ground, though some of his confidence began to waver under her direct attention. "I'm just saying that in my experience, doing and teaching are two different things. Maybe we'd learn better from someone who's actually been there, someone who's taken the hard shots when everything was on the line." Maya nodded slowly, as if considering his words with genuine thoughtfulness. She looked out across the training range, where various targets were positioned at measured distances. The furthest visible target sat at 2,400 meters, a steel plate that few Marines ever attempted to engage during training. It appeared as little more than a speck against the distant hillside, barely visible even with magnification. "Stand up, Private First Class," Maya said calmly. Blake rose from his chair, suddenly less confident as he faced his instructor. The other Marines watched with growing tension, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The casual atmosphere of a routine training class had shifted into something more serious. "You see that target at the 400-meter mark?" Maya asked, pointing toward the distant steel plate barely visible on the horizon. Blake squinted, following her gesture. Even with good eyesight, the target was difficult to make out against the background terrain. "Yes, ma'am." "According to your logic, someone who has actually engaged targets at that distance would be better qualified to teach this class. Is that correct?" Blake felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes on him. The challenge he had issued was now being reflected back, and he was beginning to realize that he might have made a serious miscalculation. "Well, yes, ma'am. Experience matters." Maya walked over to the equipment rack where training rifles were stored. Her hands moved over the weapons with obvious familiarity, finally selecting a Barrett M82 A1.50 caliber rifle. The massive weapon was used primarily for equipment destruction and extremely long-range precision work. It weighed over 30 pounds and was nearly 5 feet long, a tool designed for engaging targets at distances that pushed the limits of small arms capability. "Sergeant Brennan," Maya called to the senior Marine, "would you mind setting up the spotting scope and rangefinder for the 400-meter target?" Brennan looked surprised, but immediately moved to comply. "Yes, ma'am." He began setting up the optical equipment needed to observe impacts at extreme distance, his movements quick and efficient. Despite his surprise at the sudden practical turn the class had taken, his professional instincts took over. The other Marines watched with growing interest as Maya carried the Barrett to the shooting position. The rifle's massive proportions made it impressive even by military standards. She set it on the shooting table and began making adjustments to the scope, her movements smooth and practiced. There was no hesitation in her actions, no uncertainty about the weapon's operation. "Ma'am," Tyler spoke up, his voice uncertain, "that target, 2,400 meters with a .50 cal. That's challenging," Maya finished, continuing her preparation. She pulled out a small notebook and began making calculations, referencing wind flags positioned at various points downrange. Her notes were precise, organized, the work of someone who had performed these calculations many times under various conditions. The notebook itself was worn, clearly used in the field rather than just for classroom demonstrations. Blake watched with growing unease as Maya worked. What had started as a challenge to her credentials was rapidly becoming something more serious. He began to realize that his instructor might not be the theoretical expert he had assumed. Her movements around the weapon were too fluid, too automatic to be purely academic. "Current wind is 8 to 10 knots from the southwest," Maya murmured, more to herself than to the class. She consulted her notebook again, making additional calculations that accounted for temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. Temperature 72 degrees, humidity at 45%, barometric pressure 30.15 inches. She opened the rifle's bipod legs and adjusted the weapon's position with minute precision. The Barrett's massive muzzle brake pointed downrange toward the distant target, its imposing presence a reminder of the serious nature of what was about to occur. Maya settled behind the rifle, adjusting the stock to fit her properly, her body positioning textbook perfect. "Private First Class Hartwell," she called without moving from her position. "Since you raised the question of experience versus theory, would you care to make a prediction about this shot?" Blake's mouth felt dry. The question put him in an impossible position. If he said the shot was impossible, he would look foolish if she succeeded. If he said it was possible, he would undermine his own argument about the difficulty of long-range shooting. "Ma'am?" "The target is 2,400 meters away. Given current conditions, accounting for all the variables we've discussed in class, do you think this shot is possible?" Blake looked at the distant target, barely visible even with the naked eye. At that distance, dozens of variables could affect bullet flight. Wind changes, temperature variations, even the rotation of the Earth became significant factors. He had never attempted anything close to this range, and his confidence evaporated as he contemplated the difficulty. That's a very long shot, ma'am, beyond what most people can consistently hit. The variables at that range." "Most people," Maya repeated, her voice thoughtful. She made a final adjustment to her scope and settled into her shooting position. Her breathing became slow, controlled, the rhythm of someone who had done this many times before. "Sergeant Brennan, do you have the target acquired in the spotting scope?" Brennan, who had been watching the proceedings with growing amazement, quickly focused his optics. "Yes, ma'am. Target acquired. Clear field of fire. No movement in the impact area." Maya's voice became quieter, more focused. The transformation was subtle but noticeable to anyone paying attention. The instructor had disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. Fire in the hole. The Barrett's report was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed across the desert training area and seemed to roll on forever. The massive rifle's recoil drove it back against Maya's shoulder, but she rode it smoothly, maintaining her position behind the scope. The muzzle brake directed the blast sideways, creating a pressure wave that several Marines felt even from their seated positions. For a moment, nothing happened. At 2,400 meters, even a perfectly placed shot would take several seconds to reach its target. The bullet would travel nearly 2.5 miles, fighting gravity, wind, and atmospheric resistance every foot of the way. The Marines watched in tense silence, some holding their breath, others straining to see the distant target through squinted eyes. Then, Sergeant Brennan's voice cut through the quiet, filled with disbelief. "Hit, dead center. Perfect impact." The silence that followed was profound. 12 Marines stared at their instructor with new understanding, their previous assumptions crumbling like buildings in an earthquake. Maya calmly engaged the Barrett's safety and stood up from the shooting position. She turned to face the class, her expression unchanged, as if what had just occurred was routine rather than remarkable. "Any other questions about the practical application of these ballistic calculations?" she asked quietly. Blake's face had gone pale. The confident young Marine who had challenged Maya's credentials was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly understood how much he didn't know. "No, ma'am." Maya returned to her whiteboard and picked up her marker as if nothing had happened. "Then, let's continue with today's lesson. As I was explaining, environmental factors become critical at extended ranges. The shot you just observed required accounting for wind drift, bullet drop, temperature effects, and atmospheric pressure variations. The atmosphere in the classroom had completely changed. The Marines now listened with rapt attention as Maya continued her instruction, no longer viewing her as merely a theoretical expert. Every diagram she drew, every calculation she explained, carried the weight of demonstrated capability. The mathematics that had seemed abstract moments before now had immediate, practical relevance. Tyler raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to shoot like that?" Maya paused in her writing. For a moment, something flickered across her face, a memory perhaps of places and situations far from this training range. When she spoke, her voice carried echoes of experiences that existed beyond the boundaries of standard military training. Experience, Corporal Garrison, the kind that comes from situations where theory and practice merge out of necessity, where calculations aren't academic exercises, but the difference between mission success and failure. She returned to her lesson, but Blake found himself studying his instructor with new eyes. The confident young Marine who had challenged her credentials now realized he had been making assumptions based on incomplete information. Maya's quiet professionalism, which he had mistaken for lack of experience, was actually the hallmark of someone who had nothing to prove. "Ma'am," Blake spoke up, his earlier attitude completely gone. "I owe you an apology. I was out of line." Maya stopped writing and turned to face him. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Private First Class, in the field, assumptions can get people killed. The most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. The most valuable ally is the one whose capabilities you fully understand. She looked around at the entire class, making eye contact with each Marine. Each of you will deploy with these skills. Some of you may find yourselves in situations where a single shot determines the outcome of an engagement. When that moment comes, you won't have time to question the mathematics or debate the theory. You'll need to trust your training and execute. The lesson continued, but with a completely different dynamic. Questions came more frequently now, with genuine respect for Maya's expertise. The Marines took careful notes, no longer dismissive of the complex calculations she taught them. The demonstration had transformed abstract mathematics into concrete, life-saving knowledge. As the morning progressed, Maya covered advanced topics with new authority. How to account for altitude changes in mountainous terrain, the effect of bullet spin on long-range accuracy, methods for reading mirage and heat distortion, techniques for calculating wind drift when multiple air currents affected bullet flight. Each concept was presented with the authority of someone who had applied these principles under pressure. During a break, Tyler approached Maya privately. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Corporal." "That shot you made, 2,400 meters in training conditions. How many times have you done something like that in combat?" Maya looked out across the training range, her expression distant. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "Enough times to know that every shot matters, Corporal, and that the Marines I train deserve instruction from someone who understands what they'll face downrange." Tyler nodded slowly, processing the implications. Before you became an instructor, I was a Marine, Corporal, same as you. The details of my previous assignments are classified, but I can tell you that everything I teach in this classroom has been tested under conditions far more challenging than any training exercise. As the class resumed, Blake found himself paying attention to details he had missed before. The way Maya moved with economy and precision, how she seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked, the casual confidence with which she handled weapons that many Marines found intimidating. Her instruction took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of proven capability. "Ma'am," Blake said during another break, "I want to apologize again. I made assumptions and I was wrong." Maya studied the young Marine, seeing past his embarrassment to the lesson he was learning. "Private First Class, your question wasn't unreasonable. Marines should know the qualifications of their instructors. My response was simply more direct than usual." She finished packing and stood to leave. "Focus on the fundamentals. Master the mathematics. Practice until the mechanics become automatic. When the time comes, you'll be ready." Blake watched his instructor walk away, understanding for the first time that he had been learning from someone whose experience extended far beyond any classroom. The confident young Marine who had questioned Maya's credentials was gone, replaced by someone with a deeper appreciation for both the complexity of long-range shooting and the value of learning from true expertise. The story of Maya's demonstration spread quickly through the base, as Sergeant Brennan had predicted. But for the Marines in her class, it became something more than just a remarkable shot. It became a lesson about judgment, assumption, and the danger of underestimating those around them. From that day forward, Maya's classroom was consistently full, with Marines requesting transfer into her advanced courses. But she continued teaching with the same quiet professionalism, letting her instruction speak for itself rather than relying on reputation. And Blake? He never again questioned whether his instructor had the practical experience to back up her teaching. Instead, he focused on absorbing every lesson, knowing that someday, somewhere downrange, his life might depend on the mathematics Maya had drawn on that whiteboard. The shot that had silenced her critics became just another day of instruction for Maya Blackwood. But for the Marines she taught, it remained a reminder that excellence often comes in unexpected packages, and that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones made about quiet professionals who prefer to let their capabilities speak through action rather than words.